The future belongs to the ghosts, Derrida said. In itself, it seems like a very simple concept in that someday we'll all be dead. But will we? Are some ghosts more persistent than others? Can a ghost talk to us? Can we talk to the ghosts? The ghost always evokes a retrospective look and an incessant thinking and rethinking of the past. In this sense, spectrality is a reality of our unconsciousness. And the ghost, in its mere existence, embodies an other self within our being. Memory, nostalgia, haunted generations, revolution, José Martí, Octavio Paz, Pablo Neruda. In this episode, we will discuss these ideas, the work and impact of these figures, and more. Today, on Personae, Enrico Mario Santí. Welcome. Welcome to Personae. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm delighted that you've been invited, and this is a great occasion for me because I've always enjoyed talking to you, and this is the first time that we'll be doing it on camera, so
well,
perfect.
Yeah, let us begin by your experience in Cuba, because you were born in a period when it was a little bit dramatic in Cuba. What can you tell us about, what are your memories about Cuba during the revolution times?
Well, of course, that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
I was 12 years old when we left, but I did live in Cuba between 1959 and 62. Mm-hmm. Of course, 59 is when the revolution took over. Mm-hmm. And those 3 years were indeed very, very turbulent. My father, for example, was a professor of art, and he was dismissed from his job. The school where I used to go was confiscated, and I could no longer go to private school, so I had to go to the state school. Since my family lost employment, we had to move from one end of the island to the other, so it was indeed very turbulent at the time. And it was only when I was 12 that we left, and then we landed in Miami. And since then, there's been other types of turbulence, of course. Mm-hmm. But those were very difficult years, not only for me, but I mean, for an entire generation and for an entire society. The people who were left back in Cuba also have had it bad.
How was your family like at that point?
My dad was a sculptor. I mean, he was an artist, and he did get commissions once in a while, but not as many as he would have liked. And of course, he was a professor of art. My mother was a homemaker, and that was it. That was our sole source of income. When we left, of course, the policy of the Cuban government was that anyone who decided to emigrate would have to hand over the entire estate, that is, the house, the automobile, bank accounts, all the furniture, etc. So you only left practically with the clothes on your back, and that's what we did. And exile meant not only leaving your country, but actually starting over again, and that's basically what we had to do.
And you went to France first, or it was straight to the States?
No, it was straight to the States.
Okay.
We came straight to Miami, and that's where I grew up. I went to high school in Miami.
And how was that impact, cultural impact, that transition between being Cuban and feeling Cuban, and then all of a sudden, at the age of 12, not being that anymore?
Then being someplace else, completely different. Well, you know, it's interesting. I look back and I compare my situation with other Cubans or other emigres from other countries who went not to Miami specifically, but let's say New York or Chicago or Duluth, Minnesota, or any number of other places where there wasn't a Cuban enclave or an ethnic conclave that belonged to that group. And of course, they had it much worse. We didn't have any money. We didn't have any family there. We only had other refugees who were there with us. But what's interesting is that there was a community, and people helped each other. It's not like nowadays, you know, where the communities are so large and so impersonal that you don't get the assistance. But I can truly say that at that point, my parents were able to find friends, people who helped them, and there was a great deal of, especially political solidarity. So that was comforting.
In what sense are things changing now?
For example, for the longest time, people were not able to travel back and forth. I mean, and for, let's say, for the past at least 30 years, there's been more contact because people can, in fact, go back. I myself have gone back twice, but that was a long time ago, 78 and 79. Nowadays, people not only can go from here over there, but actually they can go from there over here. So family visitation is normal now. It's been normalized. Needless to say, since December, when diplomatic relations were established, there's been even more communication. Let's hope that there is even more communication. But what is necessary, of course, is that not only that our attitude, that is the U.S. attitude, change, but that the government in Cuba change. There has to be a lot of more change. Not for my sake, because I don't no longer live there, but obviously Cubans want more change. People who live there want more change. And the ones who need more change are the young people, because the young people see that there's nothing for them there. And one big desire for an entire generation, several generations in fact, has been to leave, to emigrate, go elsewhere, either US or France or Europe, Spain, wherever.
So when you hear the word revolution today, does that mean the same today as what it meant then, or it has changed the meaning over time as well?
Well, from you mean from a personal perspective,
of course,
right? For
yes.
what it means to me. Well, you know, revolution back then meant a lot of turbulence. It also meant war, because obviously during those 3 years that I lived there, there was a great deal of warlike conflict. You know, 1962 was the missile crisis. 1961 was the Bay of Pigs, and I happened to be in Cuba during the Bay of Pigs invasion. There was the rearming of the Cuban government against the perceived threat from the United States. So back then, revolution was a real armed struggle. With the years, of course, revolution has changed. And I dare say that today, very few people in Cuba, or very few people in the US for that matter, believe in the notion of revolution. I've heard it said so many times that they don't believe in revolution, they believe in evolution as a means of change. So I think that that's probably pretty accurate of what's happened over the years.
Alejandro Jodorowsky says something like, we don't need a revolution, we need a re-evolution, like
re-evolution, right? Well, that's more accurate. That's more accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's more accurate.
Yeah.
To talk about revolution in Cuba is almost impossible without talking about José Martí.
Yes.
When you hear the word José Martí and what he means to Cubans, how do you interpret his work? Because it's been like recruited by many people, by many political sides as well.
Right, right. Well, that's you know, that's one of the keys to Cuban history and to Cuban identity. In fact, the figure of José Martí, who was, you know, the 19th century intellectual who really reinvented Cuba, you know, for us Cubans. Don't forget that, you know, for the longest time since the 18th century, Cubans wanted to be independent from Spain. There was the 10 Years' War from 1868 to 1878 that was a failure. And so there comes Martí, was born in 53, died in 95, and he reinvents the whole Cuban independence struggle. And he has to do it not within Cuba, where he was promptly exiled after he was turned 17, but in New York, where he was an exile, and he was able to gather a lot of exiles around him and so forth. And of course, he died in 95 in the middle of a battle, one of the first battles against Spaniards in the Second Revolutionary War. And since then, he's become a symbol not only of the revolutionary struggle, because he really believed in, that what he was doing was revolutionary. I mean, obviously it was a revolutionary. It's also become a symbol for the exile, you see. So this is what's interesting, that Martí is both a standard bearer for people who never left Cuba, and also a standard bearer for people who left Cuba. So at least we want him to be all things to all people, you see. And that's what makes it interesting. But there are so many Martís. There's the Martí politician, there's the poet, there's the writer, there's the journalist, there's the lover, because he had several love affairs, some of them very well known, some of them not very well known. But he's a very complex figure, and in my family, at least, I was privileged to be taught from a very young age that Martí was special. My dad happened to be the artist who built and designed the mausoleum where José Martí is buried in Oriente province. So, I grew up in a home that called itself Martiano. We were all Martianos. And, being a Martiano is something more than just knowing his works. Being a Martiano is in fact, a way to be, a being. It's a kind of ethics. Mm-hmm. It's an identity. It's a psychological makeup. It's patriotic. And indeed, it's revolutionary.
Mm-hmm. Actually, you say that his work could be taken as a Bible. Let me quote yourself. Yeah. You mentioned this ambiguity in his work that makes him so special, what you just mentioned right now. Let me quote. El carácter ambiguo, literario y por tanto abierto de la prosa de Martí es lo que explica, al menos en parte, el por qué la obra se lee entre cubanos, un poco como la Biblia, esto es por todos. A Martí se le invoca tanto para elogiar como para condenar a los Estados Unidos, tanto para justificar como para negar al actual gobierno, y para inspirar a cubanos tanto de la isla como del exilio. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that's exactly
there we go.
There we go.
Yeah, that's precisely. I didn't know I had written that, but it sounds much better. It sounds much better when you read it, at least. And why is that? Well, I think it has to do also because he wrote so much, and you do find particularly in his journalism and his chronicles from New York, he writes against American politics, and he writes in favor of American politics. He writes praising Spain, and he also condemns Spain. He talks about the trouble with getting Cubans together, and he's talking about the desire and the need to get Cubans together. So there's a lot in Martí that simply doesn't gel. Why is that? Well, it's because he wrote for different occasions and for different audiences and at different time periods. And so you can find anything in Martí, and that's the dispute that goes on all the time, particularly between Martí scholars in the island and Martí scholars outside.
How has this figure been reshaped?
Well, I can't think of an important writer who is not problematic. And thank God that they are problematic. And why is that? Well, because it makes them more interesting.
Are they problematic? Sorry, are they problematic or problematized?
Problematized. That's right. There's this thing that's called the canon, right?
Yes.
The canon of great books. My former teacher, Harold Bloom, wrote a whole book about the Western canon. And what he says is that, canons, that is to say the classics, are important because we're always talking about them and we're always trying to decide what they mean. Well, in the case of Martí, is no different. And the problematic or the problematization of his work is the result not only of his vast work, but also of its importance, political importance, literary importance, you know, the importance to understand something which is crucial both to the United States and to Cuba, which is their historical and political relationship.
So that history, the Cuban history, is a history that repeats itself, because it's not the first time that, I mean, it's not the first revolution that took place in Cuba in history. So it's something that is in a book called La Isla que se repite.
There we go. I was just going to mention that.
Can you tell us
about well,
this
La Isla
book?
que se repite is not exactly about Cuba, it's about the Caribbean.
Yes.
And it was written by my good friend and now departed Antonio Benitez Rojo. And part of the argument there is that yes, there are repetitions in not only in Cuba but all over the Caribbean. Even geographically, you know, you have small islands, big islands, medium-sized islands, but you have a bunch of islands that you look at a map and it looks as if it's being it repeats itself. But quite apart from that particular book, which is about the Caribbean, in the case of Cuba, yes, there have been several revolutions. Yes, obviously there have been several revolutions since the colonial period, since the 18th century at least. The repeated failures towards a democratic modern system. But you know, as Freud taught us, why do we repeat things? Well, we repeat things because we have been traumatized, and not only have we been traumatized, we haven't really understood what traumatized us. So there may be a key there towards the understanding of a kind of philosophy of Cuban history, right? That there is a kind of unconscious trauma that has not been satisfactorily resolved by Cubans in general. Maybe. There may be something there.
Let me add two things. The first thing, you wrote that the more you read about Freud and you read Freud's work, the more you think he's Cuban. That's the first thing that I had to say. The second thing, I do have a quote here about a kind of national trauma that's going on in Cuba since the colonial period. That it must be a trans-generation, a trans-colonial, something like that, because Spain is somehow transferring their experience as well.
Oh, yes, yes.
So let me read this. Pocas historias como la nuestra están tan repletas de mártires y héroes. No hacen más que morirse para regresar como fantasmas, en una pesadilla recurrente que exige aún más víctimas, pero a los fantasmas se les puede ahuyentar hablándoles frente a frente. Solo así descubriremos que ellos pueblan en el centro de nuestros sueños.
Yes.
So to talk face to this haunting ghost is what Cuba has been trying to do for years.
Yes, yes.
How can we actually
do
get
that?
done?
How can we actually do that? Well, it's you know, we've been trying. It's not for lack of trying, obviously. Let me say something about Freud. Freud wasn't Cuban, but he liked Cuban cigars. and as you know, he even had got cancer of the jaw because of, you know, the many cigars that he smoked, and he only smoked Cuban cigars, just like Churchill, in fact. Yeah. So the ghosts of Cuban history I think are very real, and they are harmful. And they started the colonial period, but they got transformed over the years. After the colonial period, during the Republic, after the Republic, during the socialist, so-called socialist period, and now that we are supposed to be in a new moment, this would be a good moment to look at the ghosts and speak to them directly, you know. It would be, I think it would be very interesting for someone to do that, or maybe a bunch of us to do that. And that's homework that we have.
That in that dialogue with the ghost, I think that there are two concepts very important to talk about. One is memory, the question of memory, and the other one, the question of nostalgia.
Right, right.
And let me quote something that Guillermo Cabrera Infante said about
my good
this.
friend Guillermo Cabrera Infante.
A quote: "La nostalgia es esa puta del recuerdo."
The recuerdo, the horror of nostalgia is the horror of memory,
Yes.
or of recollection.
Yes.
Yeah, because there's something about particularly exiles, and probably not only exiles. You know, if you think, for example, the way that nostalgia is commercialized in the United States, you know, the whole retro fashion, right? Either in furniture or in consumer goods, or going back to Cuba, going as a tourist to Cuba. What's the biggest attraction in Havana right now? Two things, probably three things. One, buildings in ruins. Two, American cars from the 1950s. And three, Buena Vista Social Club, which is full of old fogies, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, this sort of retro look is okay as fashion, but does it really do the job of memory, which is the confrontation with the ghost? So that's the difference, I think, that Guillermo and I agree with him, is trying to make. It's not enough to have nostalgia. It's important to do what Freud called the working through. And that working through is hard. It's not just something that you buy or you go someplace and you acquire and so forth. Nostalgia may work for a while, for a moment. It may be a thrill, it may be a high, but it just doesn't do the job.
So is U.S. Latino literature part of that working through?
Yes. I think that now what's interesting is that this picture, the picture of U.S. Cuban exiles or Cuban exiles in the United States has been complicated by the fact that, I mean, and I think positively so, by the fact that we are not only part of a Cuban community, we are also part of the U.S. Latino community, which is obviously, you know, Cubans there are a minority. There are Mexicans, there are Puerto Ricans, there are Dominicans. There are even people from Spain who claim to be U.S. Latinos now. So it's part of a broader quilt, part of a broader map, a cultural map that is being finely drawn in the United States, and it's growing, and it's attracting a lot of attention, particularly from the financial standpoint. I tell you, you know, one country that is ideally placed in order to service that community is Spain. Spain is a natural place where Latinos can go to nurture their language, their culture, their history, their food, so many things that tie us to our Spanish roots, and it would be important for, well, I happen to know that, you know, in Spain there's a great interest in this, but I think that it should be more than just interest. There should be a true cultural investment in this phenomenon.
In one of your articles, you talk about, you have a dialogue, a hypothetical dialogue with democracy. And you ask so many questions. Actually, you ask 11 questions. I'm not going to read all of them, but they have to do with hierarchy and privileges in Cuba, certain classes in Cuba. Yeah. They have to do with economics. They have to do with liberties. And there's one final question that you say, ¿Qué más se puede pedir? What else? So that irony is part of the talk with the ghost as well.
Yes, yes. Well, I think that there's been a complacency lately about particularly for the past year, the complacency has to do with, well, you know, we're going to lift the embargo and everybody's going to be rich. So everything is hunky-dory and we won't have problems anymore. Right. Well, you know, happiness is more than just getting money, you know. And people want, not only in Cuba, but anywhere, to be at peace with their neighbors. They want to be able to express themselves freely. They want their rights to be respected. They don't want to see other people being tortured or mistreated because of their feelings, their ideas, or whatever or their beliefs. I mean, the respect for human rights is something that mean, you know, it's a constant struggle, not only in Cuba but all over the place. I mean, we see what's happening, for example, in the Middle East right now, and it's really very, very troubling what some countries like Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, or even, you know, in Palestine and Israel. What is it that we are doing in order to improve people's lives from that standpoint? So that's what I'm concerned about. And I don't think that, you know, the last question refers to, I don't think it's too much to ask, you know, for us to be thinking in those terms, not just lifting the embargo. The embargo is part of a broader package, which is respect for human rights and civil liberties.
But democracy is not the panacea, is it? I mean,
No, it's not.
We have so many issues going on, and you talk about torture, you talk about not respecting human rights, but that happens in democracies as well.
In democracies too. That's right. Absolutely. No, I didn't say that democracy was. I mean, and it's you know, I should know that in my laundry list of the things that Cubans should be thinking about, I did not include democracy. Excuse me. But obviously that's part and parcel. I mean, democracy subtends all of these things. At the same time, democracy is not a panacea. Money is not a panacea, and democracy is not the panacea.
So what is?
So I don't think that there is. I don't think that there is. The only thing that there is the constant search for these things. In other words, to be conscious of these things. One of my teachers, Octavio Paz, whose portrait is right in between us, used to say that democratic systems can only survive if there are democratic people behind them. You know, it doesn't matter how much of an democratic institution you have created or set up if you don't have people who are actually respecting these things. In the case of Mexico, where Paz was from, is a case in point. How many violations of human rights don't we see in Mexico every single day? Or for that matter, how many violations of human rights don't we see in the United States, police brutality and all these things that are so awful that go on every day? And that has to do with lack of respect for human rights.
Talking about Octavio Paz.
One of my favorite subjects.
Yes. What does it mean to you personally?
Well, first of all, as you know, a great deal of my work has had to do with the place of poetry in contemporary culture. And it's not that I have tried to create an overall theory of the place of poetry in contemporary culture, but that through individual cases, what I've been trying to research is, what is it about certain people who not only write poetry, but also reflect upon the importance of poetry for people. I was just thinking, as I was driving over here, in fact, this morning, how here at UK, for example, we have had the year of Russia, we have had the year of Mexico, we have had the year of Middle East, and this year it's the year of Europe. What I would like to propose, our dean, is that we have the year of poetry. Because if you have the year of poetry, you have the entire world. You have all of these, and then you have even more. You have the year of Africa, you have the year of Asia, you have everybody. Oh, we also had the year of China. Excuse me, I forgot about that one. And I think we also had the year of Russia, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, the place of poetry, but within individuals who are also able to reflect upon poetry. And of course, Martí is one of them. José Lezama Lima is another one. But of course, Octavio Paz is probably the most eloquent poet and intellectual we have had in Latin America in the 20th century. And that's the importance that he has for me, aside from the fact, of course, that he was my friend and that we worked together for 20 years.
He was a public figure, number one. So he was an intellectual and he made an impact in society. What is the role nowadays of intellectuals, literary critics, and you know, in regards to society?
Yeah, well, it depends on which country and which society you're talking about. People complain all the time that in the U.S., in America, the role of the intellectual is much diminished since World War II. It used to be that intellectuals had much more of an impact on public opinion, on taste, on values. But since World War II, there's been a revolution, let's say, in the way society organizes itself. Are intellectuals possible within social media? Or in fact, is everybody an intellectual in social media? Everybody is an intellectual in Facebook, and everybody is an intellectual in Twitter, right? Because everybody has an opinion, and everybody counts. So you might say, well, then that means that democratization, right, that is, everybody has a voice and everybody has an opinion, sort of kills the intellectual. And in a way, it's true. In a way, you know, the figure of the intellectual is a kind of elite, powerful, privileged mind who has the solution to everything. Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, Ortega y Gasset, Octavio Paz, etc. That's, I'm not going to say it's dead, but it's certainly a dying race, you know, a dying species.
And then if the intellectuals are in that place, in that position, where are the writers?
Yeah, yeah.
Where are the writers in society? Because there is no, you argue that there's no strong connection between the academia and the writers.
Yeah, yeah, and that's always been a great problem, particularly after World War II. I would dare say that there's much more of a link between, or I would hope that there is much more of a link between writers and artists and the academic world in Europe and in Latin America, which, you know, have a different tradition than in the U.S., where at least during the 20th century, that link was very weak. However, I have the feeling, or at least I have the hope, that things are changing. And that more and more we are realizing that a professor, for example, who writes poetry or who writes novels doesn't make, is not any less of an intellectual or a responsible academic simply because he does this sort of thing. In other words, being a writer and an artist within the academy now, it's much more accepted. And that's a good thing. And I hope that trend continues. Here in the UK, as you probably know, recently there's been the inauguration of a huge School of Art and Visual Studies. And that's fantastic. I think that that's all to the good. But we need to do more. I think we need to do more, particularly in the area of recognizing that artists and particularly writers in the U.S. are multicultural. I mean, they write in different languages. They work from different cultures with different premises, and you know, there's a huge quilt that needs to be addressed, and clearly we can't address all of them. But there should be a recognition that these things, I mean, that this quilt exists.
But in the age of Twitter, 140 characters, who reads those writers?
That's right.
We need readers.
Yeah. So can we say that writing is is dying? I don't know. You know, I'm no expert on publishing, but I certainly go to bookstores. And I was just, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I was in San Francisco. They invited me to talk about my friend Benitez Rojo, because a novel of his was published in translation. A novel had appeared in Spanish 10 years ago, and man, the amount of novelties, that is, of newly published books that I saw in the City Lights bookstore in San Francisco, where I was speaking, was just fabulous. And you know, it just you know, it made me realize how much publishing goes on, and that's only in English, and that's only in the United States, and that's only one bookstore. Can you imagine, you know, in other places like Madrid? When I go to Madrid, I go crazy. When I go to Buenos Aires, you know, I go crazy too. When I go to Paris or London, the amount of publishing that goes on. So the question is, well, if so much publishing is going on, are these books being read? I think it seems to me that they are. They must be, otherwise they wouldn't be publishing them, right? So yeah, there's a lot of tweeting around, or tweeting around, and Facebooking, but there's also a lot of reading going on, and there are a lot of publications. Writers are making, you know, are creating, and publishers are making money.
When we talk about that link, trying to link society and the writers and the intellectual, Octavio Paz was everything. He wrote as a journalist, and he wrote as a poet, and he was an intellectual. He was a diplomat. So
he was a diplomat. That's right.
But
that was only for one part of his life, though.
Yeah, from 1945 to 1968.
Yeah, well, from 1945 to 1968, he was a diplomat.
Yes.
After 1968, he was no longer a diplomat.
And he became popular after that.
But let's say the Paz before 1968 was not a public figure. He was a diplomat, but he wasn't. He was a poet, and he was known among writers. But it was in 1968 that sort of catapulted him to the world stage. And why was that? It's because he resigned his diplomatic post over the murder of students in Mexico City. And he was so indignant about the whole thing that he said, I'm not going to put up with this nonsense anymore, and I'm resigning, and I'm condemning the Mexican state. And so that's when he put his foot down. And from 1968 on, until his death 30 years later, he became a public figure, and he was very, very outspoken. Very outspoken against the Mexican state, very outspoken against the remains of communism, authoritarian communism, or authoritarian socialism. But he also condemned, you know, the abuses of capitalism, not only in Mexico, but everywhere. And of course, he kept on writing poetry.
So do intellectuals need to be compromised politically, or not necessarily? Well,
you know, there's a big debate about that. Should an intellectual be engaged in engagement, was the word that the French used, particularly in the post-war period? Do intellectuals need to be engaged, or can an intellectual be passive and simply write about, I don't know, art and about these other things? Well, there's a big debate about that. It depends on how you define the intellectual. Sartre, for example, felt that, you know, you weren't an intellectual unless you meddled in other people's business. You know, that you got involved in things that you didn't know much about. although he knew about a lot of things, of course. In other words, but Sartre was by profession a philosopher, but he said, it's not enough to just write about philosophy. You have to write about politics, you have to write about foreign relations, you have to write about identity, psychology, and so forth. And he did all of these things. And but other writers and other intellectuals feel that the problem with getting too engaged is that sometimes then you become identified with certain political positions. For example,
Pablo Neruda.
Neruda, for example. Neruda, after the Spanish Civil War, became a Stalinist, and he defended Stalin and wrote poetry defending Stalinism, not only the Soviet Union, but Stalin. And of course, that's unforgivable, because at the same time that he was doing that, Stalin was murdering millions of people. And never was there any hint of a critique on the part of Neruda about what Stalin was doing. He talked a lot about Hitler and about Hitler's and fascism in general, but never did he talk about Stalinism. So, someone like Paz would say is that intellectuals must or writers must observe a distance from the prince. The prince being, of course, power, right? Public power. And the prince must be different from the interests. The interests of the writer cannot be the interests of the prince. Because the moment you do that, then obviously you have to abdicate your independence and the power you have as a writer to criticize, whether it be the church, a political party, a certain decision, such as murdering students, for example. So these things are very, they're part of a debate. They're part of a huge debate that goes on in our society about the writers, the role of literature, intellectuals, the relationship between intellectuals and power.
But intellectuals are not considered to be the same in the US, as you mentioned, and in Europe. Writers in Europe tend to be those leading figures, cultural leading figures, that I don't feel they are here.
No, and part of the problem, of course, is that in Europe, there is, or at least I would like to think so, there is much more of an organic relationship between society and intellectual activity. And that is, the world of thinking and the world of doing are not disengaged. They come together. I would like to know, for example, of American politicians, of U.S. politicians, which writers they read or they know about. I would like to know, for example, if the Speaker of the House, Representative Boehner, what he reads. I would like to know what President Obama reads. I would like to know what Mr. Trump reads. I would like to know what Carly Fiorina reads. I would like to know what Dr. Ben Carson reads. But I'm afraid that if I ever ask that a very indiscreet question, they'll either ignore it altogether or they'll give the wrong answer.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit more about Pablo Neruda and your concept of imaginación profética. What do you mean by that?
Well, this was, of course, my first foray into academic life. I was privileged to study at Yale with the biographer of Pablo Neruda, Emil Rodriguez Monegal, a much maligned figure in Latin American criticism because of his involvement in politics, in fact. But that's another story. What's interesting is that, one of the first courses I took with Emir at Yale was a course on Pablo Neruda and Walt Whitman. And, this really you know, I thought that this was a wonderful occasion not only to do comparative literature, which I've always been interested in, that is, literature in several languages, but also the spread of this image across, that is, the image of the poet-prophet, across different languages, different periods, different genres. And so, you know, soon enough, I discovered that this was part of the romantic imagination, right? The romantics see themselves, romantic poets particularly, see themselves as, what did Shelley say, the unacknowledged legislators of mankind, right? So they can't win an election, but they will act as if they have the word as being as inherited from a sacred book like the Bible, or prophets such as those of the Old Testament. So that was the model.
And that's the Neruda you're interested in.
Right. That the Neruda that I was interested in was not the poet of the 20 love poems and a song of despair, but I was interested in Neruda, the visionary poet, in residence on Earth, his surrealist poetry. And then, of course, I was very interested in the Canto General. I see that you brought the edition of Canto General that I did a number of years ago, because that is, in fact, the Latin American equivalent of the Bible. It's a sacred book. It has the history of Latin America written from the point of view of the oppressed. It's full of biblical imagery, biblical rhetoric, and of course, the figure of the poet appears there as a prophet. So that's what really interested me, and that was the subject of my dissertation and of my first book.
And how did you get from there to Octavio Paz?
Yeah, I get a lot of that. I get a lot of that. They say, well, how did you switch from one to the other? Well, it was day and night. You know, it was going from one type of poet to another kind of type of poet. And you know, when I first met Octavio Paz, he said, you know, one of my first conversations with him, he said, what have you done? And he said, well, I've written a book on Neruda. And so he went, oh my God. And of course, he and Neruda had been friends back in the 40s. Actually, they met in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. He said, did you read what Pablo Neruda said about me? And I said, you mean what he says in his memoirs? And he said, yes. He says that he discovered me. And then Octavio sort of looked and he said, you know something, he was right. He did discover me. And of course, you know, he and Neruda had you know, a big fight in Mexico over some petty things, but mostly it was political disagreements. Neruda was a Stalinist, Octavio Paz was not, and so, you know, they diverged. But it was years later in London, in fact, where they finally met and reconciled, very briefly, because 1 or 2 years later, Neruda died in Chile, and they were never able to get together again.
And you're writing an intellectual biography about Paz.
Yes, I've been writing this forever.
Yes.
You know, I hope the book survives me. But yes, I've been doing that for at least 30 years now, and it's almost finished. I say, you know, I've been saying that it's almost finished because I've been gathering a lot of information, both from Paz, because I worked with him for 20 years and a number of editions of his work, including, you know, his masterpiece, The Labyrinth of Solitude. But the idea of this intellectual biography is that rather than writing a biography which really uses the works to understand the life, I've been doing the opposite. I've been using the life in order to organize and to understand the works.
Because you do mention that there are at least 2,500 letters
Yes.
Because he wrote a lot of letters.
Yes.
And he had
Yes. And
correspondence.
those have never been published in book form, or rather, only a portion has been published in book form. So yes, one of the things that I've been doing is gathering his correspondence from all over the world, and with a number of people from Saint Jean-Perse and André Breton to Sebastián Salazar Bondi, or unfortunately there are none to Neruda, but a number of Mexican figures, people in Spain, Fernando de los Rios, Buñuel, for example.
And you mentioned that you being able to access pretty much everything, but
no,
Carlos Fuentes.
Yeah, Carlos Fuentes, his letters have just recently opened up.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, so
Excellent.
I did check those. No, but there's a whole archive of past that is off limits, and is in fact off limits not only to me but to everybody, which is what his widow owns, and she's never allowed anyone to use that, to partake of that. But hopefully one day it will be open. I don't know if I will ever get to see it, but someday I think researchers will be able to complete whatever I or other people have been doing on Paz.
Now, Paz is not the only intellectual that you've been writing, not writing, working with. I've had the privilege of knowing a lot of writers, and to become interested in their work. You know, there's nothing more not only flattering, but more comforting for a writer to know that someone takes interest in his or her work. I think that's, you know, it's more than just a compliment. It's an honor that you are bestowing upon the writer. So this has been for me, it's been not only a code of honor, it's been also something natural. You know, I've become friends with these people. In the case of Reinaldo Arenas, because this is a guy who suffered enormously while he was in Cuba, persecuted for not only smuggling his works out, but also for being gay. In the case of Cabrera Infante, because he broke with the Cuban government early on, and they never forgave him. Why? Because he came from a communist family. No?
And he lived in exile.
London for 30 years.
He used to live. He died in London.
Yes.
He died in London in 2005. So yes, these people have been more than just, you know, books that I read or write about. These are people I grew up with.
And where are we going now? Where is the academia, where is the cultural studies, the Hispanic cultural studies heading to?
Well, you know, that's a very good question, and I wish I could answer it. I'd like to think that I've always been doing cultural studies myself. You know, nowadays, I think there's too much of a, you know, attempt to redefine what culture is all about, or cultural studies is all about. And yeah, it's true that you cut across disciplines, and you cut across languages, and you cut across ways of reading and interpreting. But, you know, in my work, I've been using history, psychoanalysis, sociology, politics, as well as literature, poetry, close reading. I wish I knew where the redefinition of culture is going nowadays. What I have seen is very encouraging. You know, the things that are being done are very exciting, and I certainly hope that, you know, future generations can profit from it. I know that I've done my work for whatever it's worth. My present contribution, which is this biography of Octavio Paz, which is what I'm working on now, I do hope it's a positive contribution.
I feel like it's overwhelming. The academia, the cultural studies is so vast.
Yes.
there is really, I mean, one can easily get disoriented.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. But that's why it's so important, and it's always been important, not just now. It's always been important to really define what you're interested in. As I tell my students all the time, there's nothing wrong with saying at the beginning of a dissertation, I know that this subject is vast, but I'm only interested in A, B, and C. And that's what I'm setting out to demonstrate to you. And why is that? Well, because a dissertation is not supposed to be an encyclopedia. A dissertation is simply you order a number of text and documents and evidence, and you organize it clearly, and you reach certain conclusions, and that's it. I mean, we're not asking you to change the world or to rewrite the library.
There's a feeling of somehow feeling, I said overwhelmed, but
yes.
what I meant was pretty much like you have the feeling that you never know enough.
That's right. Here's something that can go on forever. I certainly feel like that. I've been working on a book for 30 years. And sometimes I feel, when will this archive ever end? To just give you one example of many, in the vast bibliography that has to do with Octavio Paz, there's the whole relationship with surrealism, for example. And there's just so much there that has been said and has been done, and that I have found that needs to be said and has not been said. And I'm sure that other people will come after me and will think exactly the same thing. So it's good to have this humbling experience of knowing that knowledge is beyond you.
Okay, so I think that's everything for today.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.
I hope that intellectual biography comes out soon.
I hope so too. Dios te oiga.
Y nada más. Muchas gracias. Santí.
Oh, thank you so much.
Gracias.
Well, thank you, Jose Maria, for this wonderful opportunity. As I did this interview with you, I was recalling two quotations. One from Dale Carnegie in his famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He said, if you want to impress somebody you just met, ask him or her about him or her, about his life and about what he's interested. So obviously, you and I are friends now. But the other quotation is from that famous film, Sunset Boulevard, when at the end, Gloria Swanson walks up to the camera and says, I'm ready for my close-up. So here I am. Thank you so much.